Welcome. Welcome to the January edition of AML Voices. I'm your host, John Byrne with AML Right Source. And today it's human trafficking and labor exploitation, key strategies for public and private sector partners in 2025. I'm pleased to have three experts from the government and the private sector to walk us through a number of issues that we're all dealing with. As we know, January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and Right Source once again is doing our best to try to provide you with up-to-date information and strategies to help you in your day-to-day activity to combat these awful crimes. With me today is Harry Chavis. He's the Special Agent in Charge, IRS CI in the New York Field Office. Also, HSI Unit Chief for Training and Victim Protection from the Center for Countering Human Trafficking, Kara Rose, and Rafi Crockett, who's the Director of the FIU at Polaris, a longtime partner of the private sector and the public sector in dealing with human trafficking, smuggling, and labor exploitation. So for the next hour, we're going to cover a number of topics under this broad umbrella of human trafficking and labor exploitation. We do have the ability for you to put your questions in our chat box in the Q&A box, so I'll be looking at those throughout the hour. I'd like to start off and asking each of our panelists to talk just briefly about their organization and their relationship to anti-human trafficking and smuggling. And I'll start with you, Rafi. Polaris, our audience is well aware of the great work that you folks have done. Can you tell us a bit about the organization and particularly what you do in the FIU that you've put together there at Polaris?
Sure. Thanks for always supporting Polaris and giving us a platform to discuss human trafficking. Thank you again so much. So you all probably know Polaris most for operating the National Human Trafficking Hotline, but Polaris also has a research and intelligence function, and that is primarily supported through partnerships with the private sector. So the Financial Intelligence Unit that I manage is a partnership with the financial services industry. Financial service providers recognized that there were really missing some things when it came to human trafficking and looked to us as experts in that space and said, how can we partner together so that we can better combat this crime as a financial crime? And so the FIU provides tactical intelligence reports to our financial institution partners, where we identify potential traffickers, any PII we have on them, their modus operandi, their associates, their businesses, as well as any financial data. We often have information about their P2P accounts, sometimes their bank accounts as well. And the FIU also provides our financial institution partners with strategic reports. Some of those we also make public, but these reports identify trends and typologies and new issues that we might be seeing in the trafficking space. And so we recently released reports on the use of short-term rentals for sex trafficking. And we also released a report a few months ago about debarred farm labor contractors as an indicator of labor trafficking. And so it's really because of these creative partnerships that Polaris is able to provide the unique value that we do to so many industries, not just the financial services industry, as various industries work to combat human trafficking.
Thanks, Rafi. And we're going to come back to you in a bit to talk about labor trafficking specifically, because it's an element we're aware of, but sometimes I don't think the community appreciates the volume there as well, because we are obviously focused also on human trafficking. Kara, let me go to you. Obviously, the DHS has been very active in the anti-trafficking space as far back at least as 2010 when you first created the Blue Campaign. You now have a Center for Countering Human Trafficking. Tell us a bit about how DHS is acting with the various issues that challenge both the government and the private sector.
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks for including the CCHT in this webinar today. So a little bit of background on DHS in general, as far as when we really began to get involved in the counter human trafficking space, really was from 2000, from the TVPA. I think that HSI was really one of the leading agencies to recognize the need to combat human trafficking, and that we had specific skill sets to do so, with merging, especially after 9/11 and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. We had the skill sets from the U.S. Customs Service and the INS, so they kind of merged us and recognized that we would have the tools and the capabilities to begin to really combat human trafficking. And as we began to work towards seeing more cases of forced labor and labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and having a workforce that began to get educated on these types of investigations and the challenges and how we can prosecute them and investigate them effectively, it really began to become like an HSI mission where all of our offices had their own, not in every, but the larger offices had their own human trafficking investigative units. So we kind of got out in front of it. And then when the Blue campaign began in 2010, which was the public facing outreach campaign for the Department of Homeland Security, which started out very small, I think that kind of began to really assist with our messaging that these crimes are happening, they're happening out there, and we have a responsibility within the US government to investigate and prosecute them. So consistently, I think I came on in 2008 and I was put into a human exploitation group where we did human smuggling and human trafficking, which sometimes get interchanged. And I'll kind of talk about that when we go into more on the forced labor issue. But in recognizing the need to begin to, kind of transition working human trafficking cases, we began to, train our workforce, have these dedicated units, go to trainings, and then we kind of put it all in motion and began to get some successful prosecutions in these cases on the forced labor side and on the sex trafficking side, and bring that, financial aspect into our investigations, which really only bolsters them. So being able to be an investigator working the cases and then a manager supervising the cases, I can see like our progression within the Department of Homeland Security and Homeland Security Investigations, which is the investigative branch of DHS, that we have just really been able to have an increased impact in this space within DHS. So, and then lastly, so because of this incredible need for training and victim protection and these focused analytical supports within these areas of human trafficking, the DHS Center for Countering Human Trafficking was created in 2020, and then the Countering Human Trafficking Act was codified of 2021 was codified in December of 2022. And one of the really great things is that it brought the Blue campaign into this DHS Center of Countering Human Trafficking, which is HSI led, but it has 16 component agencies within DHS that are also involved. Pretty much everybody that has a hand in working in combating human trafficking in one way, shape, or form has been incorporated into the center, whether they have full-time employees that sit here at the center or we have liaisons that we contact, but we also include them in our trainings and we request trainings. We're also well equipped with bringing them into our presentations and some of our advanced webinars and trainings that we do to make it really a whole of government approach to combat this crime.
I mean, one of the big things is always with any issue that is so dramatically large in scope is to have various agencies working together and collaborating, and we know that's so important. So Harry, let me turn to you. Give us a sense of what IRSCI is doing, and then also, if you wouldn't mind, besides obviously the agency that is one of the leaders in financial crime investigations that you guys have always been, there's a tax angle here too, right? So what you can harm criminals that benefit from labor and human trafficking. So talk a bit about what IRSCI is doing, and then a little bit about the tax angle, and then again we'll return to the labor part of this, which is also so important that the community get a better grip on.
Yeah, thanks, John. So as you just kind of said and laid out that nicely for me, I kind of pitched that up. So, I was just going to kind of brag about really CI, hopefully the audience knows CI's primary mission, of course, is criminal tax cases. But because of that, our special agents are really able to hone in their accounting skills and their financial investigative skills in these investigations that lend itself to us being called into these more complex financial side of these investigations. And it really certainly kind of touches on things such as cybercrime. We've been in the space for drug trafficking for years. And of course, we step up into these issues like this, human trafficking being one of them, where certainly when you kind of look at the landscape of the criminal offenses out there, if there's a nexus to a criminal offense where there's someone benefiting, and most of them are doing it to benefit financially, that gives us a space in CI to really come in and bring our financial expertise to those investigations. So really from the human trafficking side, kind of just want to say, what are we doing in this space? We're really looking at this from the angle of, a criminal enterprise or criminal syndicate, really, because it's no different than some of the other organized crime investigations that we've conducted throughout the years. There is certainly a financial benefit to this. So that's why these people are doing it. And that's why, we're going to come in and we're going to be looking at that angle. Certainly from the money laundering side, if we can, because of course these funds have to flow through, the organization from the top all the way up to the bottom. But then, of course, what we're doing, our expertise, of course, is following that money. And there certainly are some complications with that. When you're talking about a human trafficking side here, there's certainly going to be, layering and obfuscation for some of the funds and where they're being hidden and where they're running through. But then the great part about that, as you kind of said, is it kind of comes back to our core mission, right? The tax piece of that. So what we're going to find here and what we see in some of these investigations, of course, is there's always the ability for CI to leverage some of our tax charges and the tax angle on these cases. So when you talk about kind of the labor side of things that you mentioned, certainly one of the things in our wheelhouses is employment tax cases, right? So there's often going to be a situation in these investigations where, these people and victims are forced into labor. And there's going to be, very similar things that we see in the traditional employment tax cases can be found here. They're red flags for us. And certainly these criminal syndicates that are trying to ultimately make a profit on this are going to be looking for ways not to pay taxes on that, right? So they're going to be trying to hide that, layer that. So then we're going to get back into kind of the traditional, hiding of the income, tax evasion. So that's kind of a great point for us to be able to leverage that as we bring that, financial investigative expertise into our investigations here with our partners. And I think, one other thing that's kind of unique that we're starting to see, certainly these criminals and these enterprises are trying to stay ahead of technology and be innovative themselves as they continue the criminal activity. So, over the years, of course, we've transitioned much more into a digital age now. So instead of just the traditional fiat and currency and banking transactions that we see, we're now seeing criminals kind of move into the crypto and digital asset space, right? So that's another kind of intricate piece to this that adds a layer of complication. But certainly, I'm proud to kind of say that we as special agents have to kind of stay ahead of that curve, and we have to make sure we stay innovative to be able to adapt to that as well. And we have done that. That's another angle that we're really starting to see with some of the payments from the victims, as well as the criminal syndicates, ultimately being done through virtual currency as well. So from that perspective, I think it also lends itself to kind of say there's certainly a global nexus to some of these crimes as well. It crosses borders. And one of the things that I would kind of try to hone in here at the end of closing this out is kind of what was already said by some of the other panelists. Certainly the partnerships are what's critically important for us to be able to tackle, this particular space. So when these issues pop up, we certainly can't do them, one agency at a time or one person at a time. So it's critically important in the AML space. We have great relationships with our partners at HSI, DHS, and then the law enforcement partners that we work with. But critically important to that is the AML space, because I do view that as, really our financial industry partners are on the, the eyes and ears. They're on the front lines of this, and they can certainly see some of these red flags, these indicators that would be important to kind of flag this, bring it over to our attention, because there are certainly some things we may not even be aware of that they're going to see.
Kara, before I go back to the switch to labor trafficking for a bit, anything you want to add on the crypto side of this? Because what Harry mentioned is obviously so important. We're reading more and more use of crypto to facilitate illegal activity. We've all, tried to get up to speed on not just how crypto works, but how that happens. Anything that you can add from the center's review of the use of crypto in either labor trafficking and or in the human trafficking space?
Sure. Aside from the purchasing of the crypto for investment purposes by these traffickers, I've also seen in the past where they're actually using crypto to pay for ads, where they're advertising for whether it's escort websites where they're requesting commercial sex services or advertising for commercial sex services or for relative to their business. They're using crypto to place ads for, as far as labor trafficking, forced labor, a lot of that is hidden in legitimate businesses. So they're using cryptocurrency as a means of, exchange, payment, advertising. So we are seeing that in some of our investigations. I wouldn't say that it is the norm. I think that when it comes up in an investigation, one of the great things that we have within HSI is we have not only do we have a group that's specifically focused on human trafficking, but we also have an asset identification and recovery group. So what happens was if we identify where there's a significant amount of crypto being exchanged or really any kind of like monetary instrument, we will include or assets that need to be identified for possible, recovery, seizure. If we're able to get a successful prosecution, that can be implemented in part of the whatever court processes are happening, or restitution, which is also very important in these types of cases to be able to get restitution for the victims. And we do that by, seizing obviously proceeds of the crime for whether it's, cryptocurrency or otherwise. So we'll have simultaneous investigations going on. So we'll have the criminal investigation going on, but then also there is another agent within HSI that will open up a kind of like a parallel case to just focus on asset recovery and identification. And that's usually the group that if we do uncover a significant amount of cryptocurrency being used, whether we're using it because we want to eventually seize it because it's a significant amount to for restitution or for seizure, or if we just are using that as a part of the investigative process, like this is how they're doing, they're going through non-traditional means of paying for something to what they believe is, a vote detection. But everything that I hear about cryptocurrency is that's actually the joke's on them, that it's actually fairly easy to be able to follow the money. And a lot of these cryptocurrency exchanges are working hand in hand and very well with law enforcement. So we have seen that, and we are evolving just like every other law enforcement agency to the instances where they come up in our investigations. But yeah, those are some of the more traditional ways that we're seeing the crypto being used in our human trafficking cases.
I'm going to come back to Kara and Harry and get some recommended practices for filing suspicious activity reports to report these things. But Rafi, I think even before you joined Polaris, I remember we did a presentation where we received a presentation from some of your former colleagues about labor trafficking. And I was not aware at the time that from a volume standpoint, it was even more of an issue financially than even human trafficking, which obviously is also awful. Let's talk a bit now about labor exploitation, labor trafficking. I know Polaris does reports in this space. Give us a sense of where that is, and then we'll ask all the panelists for maybe some warning signs that financial institutions can look for that could be indicators of labor exploitation.
Sure. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't know nearly as much as we could know or should know about labor trafficking. And that's just due to a lack of investigations and prosecutions on that side compared to sex trafficking. So according to the 2023 Federal Human Trafficking Report, there were actually only 5 new cases prosecuted for forced labor, which was about 2% of all human trafficking cases. And in fact, since 2000, when the TVPA was enacted, only about 5% of cases prosecuted have been for forced labor. The vast majority are for sex trafficking. And so that means we're left with a huge gap in data. Like, first, we're leaving a lot of people vulnerable and in unsafe conditions. And because we don't have investigations and prosecutions about labor trafficking, our data sets are having huge gaps that are not allowing us to understand this crime as best we could. And I'm also glad, that Kara pointed out another issue. The lack of prosecutions on the labor trafficking side means that no restitution is going to victims who are suffering, wage loss. And that's a really huge issue. And labor trafficking is all around us. It's in our hospitality industry, it's in agriculture, it's in construction, beauty services, meat and poultry processing. It's all through our supply chain. Chances are pretty high that, we've eaten something today, we've worn something today, we've used a device or a service today that unfortunately employed forced labor. And so we really need to be paying far more attention to that. A lot of it, unfortunately, is policy. Because of the way our visa programs, our H-2 visa program in particular, is set up, the program unfortunately encourages exploitation and trafficking of individuals because they are not able to exit situations that become unsafe, or situations where they're not being paid their wages because their visa is in fact tied to an employer. And so I can't necessarily leave and go to another employer if this one isn't living up to the agreed conditions in terms of housing, in terms of food and meals, in terms of the wages that are going to be paid to me. Those H-2 visa workers can't just up and leave. And oftentimes they fear deportation if they complain. They fear not being able to come back next season because, I need this job every season so that I can support the family back home. So they fear that if they tell, they'll be, blacklisted and not able to come back on a visa the following year. And then often, threats are made against their families back home. So these are people who are legally in our country as guest workers, and they're not being treated very well as guests. And those are some policy changes that we really would like to see put in place to ensure that they are not left in such vulnerable conditions that leave them ripe for exploitation. And so one of the things that Polaris has, we developed a tool called Ninechka. And Ninechka is used by workers on both Mexico and the United States. And via Ninechka, we're able to push out information to migrant workers, informing them of their rights. Once you get to the United States on your visa, this is what you're entitled to, this is what you should have. And in turn, they're able to anonymously report via Ninechka, what are the work conditions like on the farm you're at or the processing plant you're at? What was your recruiting process like? Was the recruiter possibly exploiting you for money or making promises that were not kept? And so that's another source of data that we're able to collect at Polaris to help us better understand what this migrant and visa process is like, so that we can put in place processes and initiatives to make that better for all of us.
Oh, that's fascinating, Rafi. Thank you for that. Kara, you want to add some more to what you mentioned before, but also could you talk a little bit about what you would recommend AML professionals in financial institutions they could possibly look for, and then obviously I ask Harry to weigh in as well.
Sure. Yeah. And I loved everything that Rafi said. And actually one of the things that we're working on within DHS is creating so not only do we provide obviously our free downloadable Blue Campaign materials to anybody that requests them, but we also proactively identify those types of institutions where there would be vulnerabilities. And because we are a DHS wide center, we can, find out where enforcement and removal operations in ICE, or where Customs and Border Protection might have individuals coming across the border. So we're working on kind of a little bit more streamlined screening protocols to be able to, when we encounter victims of human trafficking, be able to ask those right questions right from the very beginning of, without them having to, come into the country, maybe being, voluntarily entering the U.S. in a smuggling scheme, and then being unknowingly or unwittingly exploited or put into a human trafficking type scenario, obviously against their will. We don't want it to get to that point, but if it does, and maybe Polaris would have contact with them, or we could have contact with them at that point. Just trying to message out anywhere that we possibly can what they can do in order to report if they've become victimized or exploited. So those are things that we're continuously working on. But like Blue Campaign, for instance, they have a whole set of just indicators for financial sector on their website. Indicator cards, downloadable, kind of speaks to the indicators to look for, not even just red flags, but like not having control over their own identification or money. They always defer to somebody else to speak, or is filling out paperwork for them specific to like financial transactions or conversations. They appear to be confused, disoriented. We've had labor trafficking cases where individuals were in their situations for 6 months or more and had no idea what state they even lived in.
Wow.
So if if it's apparent that somebody is confused about where they are and what they're doing, that could be a potential indicator. They receive money handed directly over to somebody, or may have to like refer to somebody to fill out like particulars on their forms, like name, fake identification, so things like that. But all of that information, and not just one single thing is an indicator of human trafficking, but they're just indicate or an instance of human trafficking, but they're indicators and red flags that we can look for, because ultimately, like Rafi was saying, like these are lucrative businesses, some of them. Yes, you can have one single individual that is involved in a human trafficking scheme. You could have, look at P. Diddy, this incredibly wealthy, $400 million, owner who is currently, allegedly being charged with human trafficking. So it's not always the big businesses. It could be a single individual, organized crime, gangs, but you have to kind of look for this to be happening. Anybody can be a victim and anybody can be a trafficker. So you just got to keep your eyes open. And that's why we try to get as much branding and as much messaging out. As you've seen, probably if anybody has flown recently, there's these anti-human trafficking posters on the back of bathroom stalls, so that people that may get away from their traffickers and go into like an area to use a restroom can have the accessibility to make a phone call or have a number that they can reach out to and make a phone call. But the bottom line is a human being is a reusable commodity. So these organized crime and individuals that are committing crimes, instead of are shying away from drugs and guns, where once you sell your commodity, that's it, you're done. But a human being, you can make money off of and profit over and over and over again. And it really is difficult to track and stop. And Rafi's right with those numbers. Labor trafficking, especially, because a lot of forced labor and labor trafficking is hidden in plain sight, or is being transacted in legitimate businesses. You have the fear of removal of most that are involved in labor trafficking are non-citizens. So they have the fear of being removed, and if they go and try to reach out for assistance from law enforcement, they have that underlying fear. That's another thing too. John, we run the Continued Presence program, which is a temporary immigration designation for non-citizen victims of human trafficking that are assisting with our ongoing investigations. And it gives them temporary status in the U.S. for 2 years so that they can assist with an ongoing and an investigation, because we want our victim, if the one thing working human trafficking cases is you'll always hear from an investigator is you don't have a case if you don't have a victim. So we can't prosecute these cases as well as we could if we had a cooperating, present in the U.S. victim that can speak to the crimes against them. But as far as what you were saying about the things that are helpful to law enforcement, so in the process of the SAR reporting, there's a checkbox that an institution, an individual can check that is specific to human trafficking. And any type of inclusion of force, fraud, or coercion, which are the three main elements of human trafficking per the federal statute and most state statutes that have similar human trafficking laws related to the federal law. You always want to look for any means of force, any means of fraud, or any means of coercion. It doesn't have to be all three, but even just any kind of instances or indicators of one that that can be put into a narrative would be helpful as far as law enforcement go. And no detail is too minor. So even if you think something might not be important or relevant, if it's something that you witnessed or some kind of red flag or some kind of indicator, please put it in there, because not only are we using these reactively when we receive information, but we can also look at these from a proactive standpoint and kind of identify trends and things that we're seeing, like the cryptocurrency. That would be something where we have analysts that are pulling and resourcing all of that information so we can get that information out to the field agents that are working these cases. And part of what the CCHT does is we work on deconfliction. So because we have our hands in every field office, we know what cases are being worked in San Diego. Well, if we see a trend in San Diego or a question that they have, a problem that they have, and we know that a case agent in New York just had that same problem, we can kind of put them in touch with each other and they can figure out ways to combat it and, work at these cases from a larger level, as from an investigative standpoint and from using different methods of prosecutorial strategy so that we can always try to effectively get a successful prosecution. And especially with the labor trafficking cases, they're hard. There's a lot of significant challenges that come along with labor trafficking cases, from the individuals being non-citizens to the fact that there are so many legitimate businesses out there, and they're not identified as much by local law enforcement per se as you would for like a commercial sex act or something like that would kind of present as a crime that would be that would elicit a rapid law enforcement response.
Harry, a lot to unpack there, obviously, from Kara, but the labor side, and then any additional recommendations regarding SAR filings that you might have for you and your agents.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like what Kara said, and I just want to expand a little bit on some things that she said, because I think, one thing that I would push out messaging wise on what to be, on the lookout for, right? So I think sometimes there's kind of this perception that it's going to stand out. This particular red flag means it's absolutely human trafficking, right? So my caution and my, plea would be, continue to look for the red flags that just don't make sense. And the old adage, if you see something, say something. It is important, right? Because for us, kind of, to just really break it down, some of the same indicators that we're seeing in normal, like, for example, tax investigations, right? I mentioned the employment tax side of things. If you're seeing that, that there's something that doesn't add up, for example, the particular business that seems to be a legitimate business, if there's large cash transactions all of a sudden that do not seem normal for that type of a business, that's a red flag in and of itself. May not scream to you human trafficking, but one little lead that comes to us in law enforcement could really be used to break something open, and then we use that to get further into it. So I wouldn't want folks discounting something because it might seem like a one-off or not specifically human trafficking. Certainly, that the traditional things that we see still apply here in human trafficking. So if they're trying to obscure where the actual income or the flow of the money is coming from, and they're trying to hide it, are they trying to structure transactions, below the threshold? Certainly things where you may have cash transactions that appear to be, for example, cash that's being used to pay people under the table, off the books. All of those things in and of itself may not stand out as they, particular red flags specifically for human trafficking. But we still want you to make sure that you're putting that in your filings, that you're noting that, and sending that over to us. Certainly I would say from the crypto piece, just to kind of echo what Kara said, I mean, more is better for us in law enforcement. Because if there's one piece that you leave out that could be important, we don't have it. So if you can be, more is better, succinct in what you see. And then lastly, I would just kind of throw out, in addition to the traditional, banking and financial transactions that happen, any interactions that you're having with a, banking customer in person, it's also important to capture anything that may be said, any particular documents and things that are given to you. Any of those type of identifiers or actual things that are being said in that conversation could also be critically important for us. So I would just kind of throw that out there as well.
Rafi, got a couple questions for you, and then I'm going to ask you about what you folks were able to do regarding helping survivors in terms of credit ratings and that sort of thing. So the couple questions came in. One was when you were talking about your FIU, what kind of transactions do you look at, and do you share your findings and insights? So high level, they want to know both what sort of transactions do you view with your partners, and do you share those findings? And if you do, how do you share those findings? Was one question that came in.
Okay, so the Financial Intelligence Unit at Polaris partners with financial institutions, and so we have an MOU with, at this point, just over 20 different financial service providers. So from traditional banks, regional banks, national banks, to peer-to-peer payment processors. And so that's who we share our information with. And it's a one-way sharing process. Like, we share information with you. We do not expect you to share any information back with us. So the information we share, we don't know if it resulted in a SAR. We don't know what you've done with it. That's not of import to us. It's a one-way information sharing. And so we're looking at anything that's available. It's interesting to me just how much people put out there on the internet. And so we often, we can go and see Venmo transactions of individuals who we suspect to be engaged in trafficking. We put out a research paper on coded language on social media, because strings of words and letters and emojis that mean nothing to you and I mean something to people who might be attempting to buy and or sell sex via the internet. And so and they'll put strings like this in the memo line of a P2P payment, and you can see it and look for things like that. But yes, we do in fact share our information with our financial institution partners, as well as with most recently IRS CI. Yeah.
All right. The other question that came in related to the application that you talked about, and the person wanted to know, how effective is the application in reporting working conditions for those individuals? I assume it's a fairly recent app. So what can you tell us?
Nanechka.
Yeah, Nanechka. That's right.
Yes. So it's a great tool because it's anonymous. And like I said, it works on both sides of the border. And because we have Polaris partners with community organizations, civil society organizations in Mexico, who are trusted by individuals. And so they're the ones who are providing the education about the tool and how it works. And so they've already gained the trust of people in the community. And so they're able to share, this is Nanechka, this is how it works. And so the individuals are comfortable that they will be safe, that their information is not going to be shared, that nobody's going to know that it is them who is reporting about the conditions of their recruitment or the conditions that they're working under. So that's the Nanechka tool. And I just wanted to add one or two things.
Sure.
When you were asking about kind of indicators and things like that, because indicators are just that. They're generally like a presence of something. And because labor trafficking is often the absence of a financial transaction, it's much harder to identify than, somebody's paying for money for sex. There's an even exchange there we can see. So for many years, when I worked in financial institutions, I designed risk assessments. That's what I did. And I could say now, coming to Polaris, I never, in all the years I designed risk assessments, ever human trafficking was not one that we ever looked out for. We were looking at risks of, drug trafficking and weapons proliferation and transnational organized crime and things like that. Terrorism, obviously, but human trafficking wasn't one of them. And so what I encourage financial institutions to do is, because you're not going to see this in your transaction monitoring systems, it's really important that you identify this at onboarding when you are doing your periodic customer reviews every 2 to 3 years, that you're looking for things like industries that have weak protections already: construction, agriculture, landscaping, things like that. Labor contracting companies, these third parties that are providing workers to the industries, who are often middlemen who take the fall for document fraud and things like that. If you're looking at states that are rolling back child labor laws, those are the same places that have weak worker protections in general. You don't care about kids, you definitely don't care about, adult workers. Looking for companies that might have a large number of child labor law violations already. If you're onboarding a business client, look for OSHA and DOL violations of wage theft and hazardous conditions, because these can be indicative of employers that don't care about their workers' health and safety, and so certainly don't care about their financial health or safety either.
That's a great point. Yeah, the reduction of some of the child labor laws, in my humble opinion, is just insane. I want you to spend a couple of minutes to talk about the legislation that Polaris was instrumental in getting passed to help survivors with financial access. Can you talk a bit about that? I know we talked offline, and maybe it's not getting utilized as much as we'd hope. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk about it and give folks on the call here a chance to better understand what that is.
Sure. So the Debt Bondage Repair Act, really recognizes that trafficking is not just a crime against the body or a crime against the mind, but it's also very oftentimes a crime against a person's finances. So traffickers will, take out credit in their victim's name to get apartments, to get cars, credit cards, bank accounts. And obviously it's not their credit, so they don't care if it's ruined. So by the time a victim frees themselves, their credit is in the toilet oftentimes. So imagine, if you're trying to get back on your feet, but you can't even rent an apartment, and you can't even open a checking account, and you can't even get a good job because all of these things, run a credit check on you, and your credit is poor. And so what the DBRA does is works to remove adverse credit information that resulted from an individual's trafficking situation. And so there have been many financial institutions that signed on to the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, which, they pledged to, really work towards including survivors, making sure that they have access to financial services. And there's, lots of financial institutions across the country that are doing that. The real issue is that it often re-victimizes people who were previously victims, because you have to prove that you were a victim of trafficking during this time period so that they can clear your credit during that time period. And that can be traumatic for people. You're forcing people to relive their trauma just so that they can open a basic checking account. And, we sometimes need to weigh the risk versus the rewards. Like, what is the risk of giving this individual access to a basic checking account versus forcing them to relive the 3 most horrible years of their life? So I really, ask any financial institutions, for people who are in positions to onboard survivors, do so, and do so with compassion, and do so with empathy.
Thanks, Rafi. Harry, one of the questions came in directed at you. It says, "Hi, Harry. In the SAR filings, are there any instances of banks leveraging a 314B information sharing to detect human trafficking?" And Kara can weigh in as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a great question. And I guess I'll put a plug in for the 314A process, right? Because and this again, of course, is my humble opinion, but
And B and 314B as well that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah,
Please.
literally 314A and B. So this is me
Yeah.
kind of just putting a plug out that I think it's kind of underutilized. So I know we certainly will try to, in some of our investigations where we're trying to make those linkages, we're trying to do a better job as an agency educating our special agents on that. So we've kind of expanded that within ourselves as we're conducting investigations. But I do think if we're not doing that, when we start talking about, these types of cases where there's such a complex financial web that's kind of thrown out there, right? Maybe we're just initially dealing with one or two financial institutions, where if we use that process, we have the ability now, to potentially expand what we know to gather further pieces of that web that go out. So I'll just kind of say it's something that we currently utilize. We probably haven't utilized it in the past as much as we should, but I'm glad to see we're kind of making that transition now to see what a resource that can kind of be for us, and tapping into that to leverage the member banks who are participating in the 314A and B process. So,
Kara, anything to add there?
No, just that we've also benefited from that, especially because the information comes to us like proactively. So usually it involves not only the report, but like the supporting documents that would come with it, which sometimes is a challenge for us to get, not always, but, and even if it's not a challenge to get, sometimes just if it's an immediate case that we need to act upon immediately and the information would be valuable to have, it takes a little bit of time sometimes, or in the past, in my cases, it's taken a little bit of time to get those supporting documents that could be useful as evidence to, obviously parallel construct to be able to get whatever enforcement or legal process we would need to be able to further the investigation. So if we can say, if I could say anything, not only is it an important program to be a part of because it greatly assists law enforcement, but also, providing those supporting documents for the referral, the report on the front end, so that we have all the information that we would be able to need to act, effectively and as expeditiously as we can.
But open up some of these questions to the entire panel. Feel free to weigh in. First one that came in was, has there been a trend at all that indicate collusion with an internal party at a financial institution? In other words, somebody within the institution itself working and enabling human trafficking or labor exploitation. Do you have any response to that, Harry, Kara, anything you've seen?
So I have seen the collusion, but not on the human trafficking side per se. We have
Okay.
had somebody that worked in a financial institution that was a co-conspirator, but didn't use any part of the actual financial institution to benefit or further the criminal activity. She just happened to work there. But where we have seen it is in our documented benefit fraud cases. So like our really organized financial fraud schemes, where they are using their role in the financial institution to further the fraud that's being committed by individuals within, usually it has been in my experience anyway, the transnational organized crime syndicates that are operating in like the cases that we had when I worked as an agent in Baltimore were specific to West African countries that were individuals from Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire, and a lot of that is the sextortion schemes that are being perpetrated too, which is a human exploitation crime, not necessarily human trafficking, but again, where you have a lot of that money being requested through the traditional monetary financial institutions, and also all of your cash applications that are out now, Venmo, Cash App, that are being utilized to exploit money from individuals in these sextortion schemes. So which can very easily turn into human trafficking cases, child exploitation, human exploitation cases, because we do have sex trafficking of children that sometimes presents as a child exploitation case, but inevitably we're able to charge sex trafficking of a minor in some of those cases. So the human exploitation cases definitely go hand in hand, but we are seeing a lot of fraud in regards to like internal financial institutions with our document and benefit fraud schemes that we're investigating.
All right. Harry, similar on your end?
Yeah, pretty similar to what Kara said. I think haven't seen necessarily the inside conspirators in the financial institutions on the human trafficking side, but similar to what she said, certainly the financial fraud side of it, we've definitely seen that. Certainly more recently related to some of the COVID fraud stuff that we had. That's a great example of where we had someone, kind of on the inside helping facilitate that as a conspirator, but not necessarily specific to the human trafficking side just yet.
This one probably demands a lengthier answer, but maybe just a quick response from both of you from the government. This person said they're currently developing an intelligence report on human trafficking in the EU, and they want to know what commonalities and linkages are you seeing between US and EU criminal organizations when moving people and laundering money? Just high level, Kara, just a couple thoughts, and then Harry as well.
What specifically we've seen like our in the past the higher level like escort agencies. So we have less organized human trafficking related crimes, and then we have more organized human trafficking related crimes. So a lot of what we're seeing in the EU, like as far as like refugees that are they're using refugees and asylees, or just straight up utilizing some of the South American or Mexican cartels to be able to smuggle individuals into the country, but then are using them in larger like exploitative schemes that we're seeing, but like not really any specific intel. It's really like a case by case basis. We're not really seeing on a larger scheme. Definitely the human smuggling aspect of it, importing people, into the country, obviously contrary to our laws, but not necessarily that we're following through to see these larger human trafficking schemes that are coming out of these endeavors. Because it's all about, making money, so to speak. So if they're making enough money by, just, smuggling individuals into the country, whether it's like these illicit smuggling schemes with fake documents and more organized, or if it's just simply walking across the southern border with a guide, it varies. But we're not seeing any like incredibly high level trends that are going on, at least not to my knowledge at this point. And because we have visibility on like our attaché offices and the field offices, that's something that I probably would have hopefully been made aware of if there was something to report in that regard.
Good. I assume the same, Harry.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I think at the end of the day, look, it becomes one of those things where each of these things are operating, the same way, right? So we're not seeing any big differences.
Okay, Rafi, couple for you. If people, institutions who are not part of the information exchange that Polaris have want to get involved, I know obviously you have to sign MOUs or related documents. Can they reach out directly to you and say, hey, they want to be part of this, and you'll tell them what the process is?
Yep, they can email fiu@polarisproject.org. fiu@polarisproject.org, and we can set up a time to just talk about what the partnership looks like. We also operate a bi-monthly AML human trafficking discussion group. Mm-hmm. And when you were talking about, information sharing between financial institutions, we found that that's a really unique space that they use to share best practices with one another, what they're seeing at their institutions that might be informed by some other folks. And then it also allows for, when we share our reports monthly with these institutions, they each have shared a point of contact. And so if you're at one institution and you get our report and you come up with something and you think, oh, I think this intersects with another institution, they can then contact that POC at that other institution and say, hey, the report we got from Polaris indicates that your institution might have something to do with this. If you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, take a look and, see that there's money flowing between our two institutions.
I think I know the answer to the next one, but I think people are sincerely asking, given what you just said about survivors. But is there a possibility of having a list of survivors to help them through financial recovery. Why don't you talk a bit about the privacy aspect of that and how that works? So you obviously just mentioned before that, to try to help these people get at least basic checking accounts and that sort of thing. But obviously, if they've not approached a particular institution, I would imagine that a list would be problematic just because of the danger of it getting in the wrong hands. But how would you respond to that?
So there is no list, but one of the things that happens under the Debt Bondage Repair Act is that various nonprofit organizations, including Polaris, essentially we provide a letter to a financial institution stating that yes, we know this individual and we know them to be a survivor of human trafficking, and so that's generally how individuals are able to get access through to financial institutions, and also how they're able to get access to their credit repair services under the DBRA and there's dozens of nonprofits primarily all over the country, as well as law enforcement. And so if you are a victim and you've been involved in some kind of case, a prosecution, that prosecutor's office is also able to provide letters stating, yes, we attest that this individual is in fact a victim of trafficking.
We just have a couple of minutes left. This has gone really fast in a good way because you guys have provided us great information. I'm going to ask you for some final thoughts. I know, Kara, we didn't get a chance to dive into the increase in gang activity, but just one or two items you want to make sure you mention to the audience in terms of what to be prepared for the challenges going in 2025. And then I'll ask Carrie and Rafi the same.
Sure. Yeah, I think just being aware and cognizant of what to look for. I think Rafi and Harry both gave like a lot of great examples. One of the things that stuck out was lack of evidence is also evidence. I know that's really aggravating to hear because people say, well, how if I don't see anything, how do I know that? But because you are so well in tune to what a legitimate financial transaction or case looks like, just looking for things that may be out of the box, some kind of indicator, payments to third-party recruiters, the same individual continually accompanying multiple people into a bank to deposit checks, checks being checks within the same time of like payment period to the same person, but in different amounts, like they're structuring, or somebody else could be possibly being paid under a different social security number. So anything that could be like, a lot of this is going to look like fraud. Like you may not see the force aspect of it. You may not see somebody walking into a bank like chained up and they have visible signs of abuse on them. So I think this is going to present more of like the fraud, but then unraveling that a little bit, just putting those indicators in, like Harry was saying, and then law enforcement can take a look at that and say, well, that looks like another case that we had where this individual was, in this, or the same businesses, right, are being accused time and time again over, like I had a labor trafficking case, not to go into specifics of it, but this company had been accused in the past of labor exploitation. Well, when we were able to kind of uncover the new scenario, because they took a break, because they knew that they were being investigated, there was like news articles that were being done about them, but no law enforcement involvement. So when we got involved, we were able to go back and utilize all that information that wasn't really reported to law enforcement. So keeping those records, creating some kind of a almost like a timeline of transactions within, so not just necessarily focus on the immediate, but also being receptive to providing additional information from the past, whether it needs to be a request from law enforcement or you can proactively do that. That's something also that would be helpful, because a pattern of practice is also something that really assists us when we are looking at these cases and looking at these schemes that usually have gone on for way longer than they present initially.
Great. Thanks, Kara. Harry, final thoughts?
Yeah, so just kind of expanding upon what she said, I think just reiterating a couple of things that we previously said, critically keeping your eyes and ears open, don't, be afraid to report something. The more we know, the better. And really just emphasizing the importance of the partnerships, because that's really what helps us tackle this issue. And I'm glad that CI and our law enforcement partners have bonds where we're really stepping up and fighting this issue. It's a heinous crime, and it's real victims involved. So I think it's even more important to forge those relationships with the financial institution partners, the law enforcement partnerships, where we can kind of talk about the trends and keep kind of bringing these things to the surface. So I would just say keep doing that. The more you get to us, the better. And we're more than happy as we are today to kind of partner, in future endeavors to try and get that message across to your workforce.
Great. Thanks, Harry. Rafi.
I just want to reiterate that it's really about partnerships. That is how we tackle this crime, is all of us coming together and really thinking outside the box, so that it's not always the traditional like public-private partnership, that there are many civil society organizations like Polaris. There are other private institutions beyond just your financial institution, but other industries who are tackling the same issues. Short-term rental industry is asking the same questions that financial services are asking the same questions that rideshare are asking as it relates to human trafficking. And so when we all come together and have these conversations, we can be that much more effective.
That's such an important point. The partnership aspect, that's what this is about today. You folks have been so generous with your time today and your insight. I want to thank Harry Chavis, Kara Rose, and Rafi Crockett for their work today. All three of these entities, IRSCI, DHS, and of course Polaris, have great information on their sites. You can sign up for their newsletters, their guidance documents. So please feel free to do that. It becomes really important. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Next month, February 27th, our program will be on international and domestic corruption. Thanks everybody. Appreciate your time today. Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.